Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 19th of August 2015. My name is TotalBiscuit with today's gaming news and comment. Coming up in the show, let's talk about things that Peter Moore has said. Two different things, in fact. The first thing being that he believes that on-disc DLC complaints are nonsense, and his comments on the lack of single-player for Star Wars Battlefront. All this in the OC Remix track of the day is coming your way right about now. Well, it's been a slow few weeks in terms of news, hasn't it? So let's revisit something that came along a little while ago, about a week or so ago. It was a GameSpot interview with Peter Moore, which spawned two interesting little discussions, I felt. We're going to deal with both of those on the show today. The interview has a number of interesting points, but I feel these are the two which were most interesting. So, a direct quote from Peter Moore here in terms of DLC. He said that a lot of resistance to DLC comes from the erroneous belief that somehow companies will ship a game incomplete and then try to sell you stuff they have already made and held back. Nonsense. Now, we could take that quote on its own, but frankly, that would be a little bit dodgy and sensationalist to say the least, because it's not like that's all he said. He went on to say that people will no doubt accuse me of being a total corporate shill for saying this. I mean, I certainly hope you're a total corporate shill. That is literally your job, but never mind. Anyway, but I think there is some confusion, he says, within game communities that when the foundations for future DLC are discovered in a game, such as the expansion levels of Destiny, people think that those foundations are already finished. The point being, development studios tend to put the basic foundations of future DLC on disk to help facilitate future updates. You need to have a look at it from a technical perspective, he says. Think of them as APIs. Knowing down the road that something needs to sit on something you've already made means that you have to put down some foundations. What people are confused about is they think DLC is secretly on the disc and it's somehow unlocked when we say. Alright, there's a number of interesting discussions that spawn from this. Firstly, why do people believe that in the first place? Is it completely without foundation? No, it isn't. And there's a number of different ways you can look at it. For instance, if you were to go strictly by DLC that was on the disc, there are several examples of titles that have done that. Ubisoft, with Assassin's Creed 2, in 2009, admitted by Ubisoft Montreal's Patrice Desolates. He actually did an interview where he admitted this. He said, I felt that, okay, there were too many things to do and finish. Okay, let's take a portion of the game that was planned and we'll give it in DLC. We'll remove some stress to the team while giving more to fans and people who like Assassin's Creed. I think we gave them so much content that they cannot say that we owe them, that we didn't give them their lot for $60. Wow, Ubisoft is so bad at speaking publicly. Anyway, that was one issue. What about the 12 fully playable characters found in Street Fighter Cross Tekken, for instance? Something that Capcom was certainly not particularly pleased with being found out about, and let's be honest, that was not the only thing that they did. In fact, there was a character and a new difficulty mode found for Resident Evil 6. That was also on the disc. Dragon's Dogma had content locked away on the disc. So those are two major studios that have quite literally done this, disc-locked content. Now, EA has been accused of this, with Mass Effect 3, for instance. Plenty of controversy surrounding the From Ashes DLC for various reasons, but part of it was found in the game. In fact, it was possible to hack the game to make the Prothean character playable. Now, that did not mean it gave you access to his mission and all sorts of things like that, but you could actually walk around and use him. A lot of that foundation was on the DLC, which is, I think, where Peter Moore's argument's sort of coming from there, because that wasn't complete, and yes, it was finished off by day one. They were also accused of doing the same thing with Stone Prisoner and the Warden's Keep DLC for Dragon Age Inquisition. But you could, if you wanted to get really, really technical and kind of dodge the overall problem, say, oh, well, they weren't complete on the disc, so it's not a problem. Okay, I get the idea of framework. I do, I really do. Software is extremely complicated. Of course you're going to build a foundation for future DLC, but the problem is with these DLC, you're not building a foundation for future DLC, you are creating a platform to support DLC that is complete and ready to go on day one. So that means that at the same time that you launched your game, you had DLC available for that game. Now, there are a huge number of problems associated with that. The first and most obvious is that the consumer perception you're going to get at that point is going to be very simple. You cut a piece of the game away and you're trying to sell it to us separately. Now, without a reasonably in-depth knowledge of how game development works, it is really hard to dispel that particular impression. And honestly, why should consumers dispel it? Or even if you bring in industry realities, it's not the sort of thing that most consumers will even understand, much less condone. It's not a great practice regardless of how you look at it. So here's maybe the best case scenario, a recent case which actually resulted in a lot of people, myself included for a while, getting kind of pissed off, and this was with Blood Bowl 2. Now, the situation with Blood Bowl 2 goes as follows. Blood Bowl 2 was delayed for several months. Now, of course, when a game gets delayed, that means that the game costs more to make, because you're keeping the studio open, you're paying salaries, you're incurring all sorts of different costs when you do this. So delaying a game can definitely suck. You know, you can absolutely understand why you try to meet deadlines, because it's not free development time. You know, it's not, hey, we put 3 months extra development time in and it doesn't cost anything. No, it costs a lot of money. So while this was occurring, this changed the timeline for their planned DLC. Now, what they plan to do is release the game earlier, and then a couple of months down the line, release DLC races, which were announced way ahead of time, and we all knew that this was going to happen. So what ended up happening was, the game was delayed, and as a result, that meant that the DLC races finished on schedule, but the game didn't finish on schedule. So the game ended up overlapping with the DLC releases. So what they decided to do was they decided to offer one of these two races as a pre-order bonus, and the other one would be available on day one for $5. Now, this got a lot of people upset because obviously they're looking at it and they're saying, oh great, you're locking content behind a pre-order wall, you're expecting us to prepay for a game that we haven't played yet, that's dishonest, that's not consumer friendly, and I would agree with them. I mean, pre-ordering games has never been consumer friendly, it still isn't, you know. Thankfully we have Steam refunds to help us out a little bit now, but still, it's not a very good idea. And you're releasing day one DLC, so we're upset about this. But the interesting thing is, had they communicated the issue better, I think people would have kind of understood why. It's only because I know this information that I look at this now and say, this is a bit more reasonable, because I understand that it costs money to make these races. Your game was delayed several months. This DLC was always planned to be paid DLC, and this was content that you had to pay to make. Now, this didn't come free. So, as a result, you could have either just waited a couple of months and just released the DLC later down the line, and no one would have really known the difference, you know, no one would have been any of the wiser. Or you can release it on day one, because it's ready, you might as well, and you can offer one of two of them for free as opposed to charging the $5 you were going to charge anyway. So if you look at it that way, with that specific knowledge, then you can say, okay, maybe this is more reasonable than I initially believed. But the thing is that most day one DLC is not in this situation at all. And that's the real problem. There are plenty of games that come out on schedule with day one DLC. You know, their deadline, their release date has been set in stone for a year, no delays whatsoever, and yet there's day one DLC anyway. And what does that present to the consumer? What it presents to the consumer is an incomplete product. I buy the game on the shelf, I expect to get the complete product at that time. But I know now that this is not the case. That $60 purchase doesn't guarantee me the full game, because there's this other little piece of DLC over there that costs $10. Mass Effect 3 was the one that really broke the camel's back for me, that said, oh, right, well, yeah, you actually have to pay $70 for this. You gotta get your digital deluxe edition. You gotta pay a little bit extra. And what really rubbed salt in the wound there was that guy is, at least in the view of anyone that's played Mass Effect 1 and 2 before starting to play Mass Effect 3, the most important guy in the entire Mass Effect trilogy. Now, whether or not that ended up being the case, I don't know. Still to this day, I did not play that game because of that. But the fact of the matter is, he's a Prothean. That's kind of important. That's a big deal in the Mass Effect lore for anyone that knows that. And having to pay $70 to get the Prothean as opposed to the $60 price of the regular game is insulting. We knew for a fact that this was ready on day one because it was on sale on day one. It doesn't matter how much of it is on the disc at that point. What we know for sure is that it's done before launch. Now, there are some situations where it's a little bit more understandable. Cosmetics is a great example. It's interesting that Evolve got screwed over as badly as it did, got such a bad consumer perception considering the amount of cosmetic DLC that was available on launch, and no real DLC, as far as I'm aware, was actually available on launch. You know, you could pre-order the Season Pass, of course, but there was no actual day one DLC that mattered in any way. You know, it was all cosmetic. And yet, that game got absolutely crapped on as well. But that's what happens when you screw up consumer perception and you find a consumer base that is frankly sick of the nonsense. and as a result, they just don't tolerate that kind of business practice anymore. The fact of the matter is that on-disc DLC is not a myth. On-disc DLC is real, it has happened before, and in many ways it is not just merely cosmetic. If it's a bunch of skins, yeah, absolutely, you can make the argument that the art team has nothing else to do, so they might as well do something like that. Okay, fine. If it's cosmetic, I do not care. That's fine by me. That's acceptable to me. When it starts to become less than cosmetic, when it becomes story critical, when it actually has a significant chunk of gameplay involved in it, and it's released on day one, that is the problem. And it does not matter whether or not a part of it is on the disc. It's irrelevant, especially in 2015, when many games are downloaded purely digitally. It doesn't matter if it's on the disc. I mean, discs, I haven't used a disc in 4 years. Why would I? I get everything digitally. There's no reason for me not to do that. So the on-disc DLC argument becomes obsolete, and what becomes very important is whether or not your DLC is ready on day one, and whether or not a consumer will accept that being the case. If you explain it well enough, say in the case of Blood Bowl 2, you might get some people to understand it. But people are sick and tired of day one DLC, and they will react extremely negatively to it. Can you blame them? I don't blame them, absolutely not. The last few years have been some of the worst in terms of getting incomplete, shoddy, buggy games. This isn't an exception. I mean, in 2014, this was the rule. I don't think Peter Moore is an idiot. I don't believe he's deliberately missing the point. I believe he knows exactly what he's talking about, because arguing about day one DLC and the legitimacy of it is a pretty damn difficult sell. Arguing about on-disc DLC and just some misunderstandings, oh, that's much, much easier. But really, that's not the problem, and it hasn't been the problem for years now. And finally, a little bit more from Peter Moore, and this time around we will not be going up against him. I might actually be agreeing with him in some ways. Now, this is in relation to Star Wars Battlefront. In the same interview with GameSpot, he spoke a little bit about a single-player campaign, or the lack thereof. This is very interesting. Now, he was asked a question by GameSpot that said, surely yourself and the rest of the EA executive team must be kicking yourselves for not including a single-player campaign in regards to Star Wars Battlefront. He says, well, you never kick yourself about those things. You make the decision years out and you plan for what the world looks like when a game ships in 2 to 3 years. He went on a little bit about Star Wars The Old Republic and the subscription model not being a very good idea. And he was asked a follow-up question. I totally understand that you have to think ahead. I was thinking more about Battlefront with more crude algebra, in that AAA games with single-player traditionally sell better than those with multiplayer. Now, he answers by saying, so there's two phenomena with that statement. The first is that, yes, you might be right, which is interesting because I don't know if the stats for that. The second is that very few people actually play the single-player in these kind of games. That's what the data points to. And there was no follow-up question there. Well, it seems like he could be right, but we are really lacking data on that. I actually went digging to see if I could find any real data. For instance, I decided to use the Steam achievement system to track data for that, because there's often an achievement for beating a single-player campaign. And I went to the old standby, which is, of course, Call of Duty, one of the most popular multiplayer games that also, by default, includes a single-player campaign that's available on Steam. The problem is that achievements are split across the single player and the multiplayer, and if you never load the single player, you're not counted as a player of it, which is, I know, a little bit odd, but it seems like the achievements are not accurate as a result because they're separate applications on Steam. So the multiplayer has a separate set of achievements to the single player. So I went to find out, like, Modern Warfare 3, I think, or Black Ops. It said, yeah, 80% of players have beaten the first mission. I was like, that seems really high. But then I realized, oh, that's 80% of players that loaded the single player in the first place, by the looks of it, from what I can tell. It's hard to say, because I'm not 100% sure how those achievements are tracked, but there is a site called Raptor.com, which did a little bit of statistical analysis back in 2011. And it said that only 17% of Battlefield 3 players completed the single-player campaign. Now, that's based on those people that actually played and used Raptor.com, so that's not necessarily an accurate number, but that is fairly interesting, to say the least. Also, Black Ops tracked on that site, 18.6% of players having finished the single-player campaign. Now, bear in mind, these campaigns are about 4 hours long at most. So those are some pretty interesting statistics. They also reported a drop across the franchise based on when the game was released. So Modern Warfare 2, according to Raptor, had a 59.1% completion rate, although bear in mind that that game had been out for several years by that point, so you'd expect a higher completion rate. And World at War had a 31.55% completion rate. Now, that is not necessarily accurate data, and it's certainly nothing to make a firm assessment on, but still, it does seem to show a downtrend in terms of the number of people buying those games for the single player. There are, of course, arguments against not including a single player. There are plenty of those. For instance, Titanfall is used by many people as a case study in why selling a AAA multiplayer-only game at $60 simply does not work. Although I'm not really sure that you could argue that that were the case, when according to the unofficial figures on VG charts, Titanfall did sell over 3 million copies by August 2014, and it's probably shifted a few more. It was also the best-selling title on the Xbox One, according to Peter Moore. Yes, indeed, that does seem to be a name that crops up quite a bit. But there were never official sales figures released for Titanfall. It is hard to know exactly how well that multiplayer-only title sold, although there is, of course, another data point you can look at, which is Evolve's sales figures. Except we can't do that either, because, yes, you guessed it, Take-Two didn't release the sales figures for that either. There was a prediction by an analyst from Cohen & Company, Doug Kreutz, that estimated 1.5 million units for the first-year sell-through. Regardless, Peter Moore's going to have information that we don't. It's as simple as that. He knows how well Titanfall sold, and of course it was sold purely on the basis of it being a multiplayer-only game. He probably also knows that Battlefront is going to sell really, really well based on its name and brand, regardless of whether or not there is a single-player campaign. And I'm going to be honest, I do not mind no time being invested into a single player. I prefer no single player to badly tacked on single player. It's a weird reverse sort of situation that we found ourselves in now versus 10 years ago. Because, of course, back then we had games like The Darkness, for instance, which featured a tacked-on multiplayer mode that served no practical purpose whatsoever. That game came out in 2007. We also had titles like, yes, Spec Ops: The Line, which had a tacked-on multiplayer mode that basically nobody played and also served no practical purpose whatsoever and even went against the very message of the game itself. You know, the developers didn't even want it in there. They were basically forced to do it by the publisher. The developer Jaeger were pretty damn pissed about that, actually. Lead designer Corey Davis said that the multiplayer should not exist and sheds a negative light on all the meaningful things we did in the single-player experience. And he's right, it did. It completely flew in the face of the message and the theme. That was back then, and there were plenty of other examples, and now it seems like it's the other way around. You know, single player is much, much more tacked on these days. The multiplayer component seems to be the component that most people play, and that's where the majority of the play hours occur. This is particularly true in most first-person shooters, with very few exceptions. You know, Wolfenstein: The New Order being a great example of a game that was purely single player, didn't have a multiplayer, didn't need a multiplayer. And that was the point, wasn't it? Would it have benefited from a multiplayer? Or probably not. I mean, if you played Wolfenstein 2009's multiplayer, that was super tacked on. But then again, if you look at Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, that came from the multiplayer of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, which was absolutely fantastic. So there are times when putting a multiplayer mode onto the single player can really help. And then there are times when it just doesn't really matter, and time would be better spent developing the multiplayer mode further. Would you sell more copies with a single player? Maybe. Certainly, but if you just tack it on, then you're diluting the quality of your product, as far as I'm concerned. You are opening yourselves up to get smacked by reviews who will take you to task for including a tacked-on single-player mode and say, oh, well, that's, you know, this was going to be a 9.5, but now it's just a mere 7.8, too much water, because it happened to have a single-player mode, or in the reverse case, a multiplayer mode that wasn't worthy of your time and was clearly not well developed. I think you can absolutely sell a multiplayer-only AAA release. It's difficult, certainly. It really, really is. You can get people playing multiplayer games only. I mean, the most popular games in the world are all multiplayer games only. That's fine, but most of them are also free to play. So that's a different matter entirely. It's a completely different market at that point. But it's about value proposition. It's about consumer perspective. They have to believe that what they're buying is worthy of the price that you're offering it at, and more often than not, if it does not include a healthy single-player campaign, then some people are going to turn around and say, sorry, I don't think that's worthy of my money. And there are cases like Titanfall and Evolve that prove perhaps that this is the case. You know, if we look at the concurrent players right now for Evolve, it's pitiful. It's dead. This game is dead. Currently, the 24-hour peak for this game is 792. Bearing in mind at launch, it peaked at 27,000 concurrent players. There are less than 1,000 people actively playing this game in a 24-hour period. Evolve is not a healthy game, and Titanfall really isn't either. And without the multiplayer, the game becomes useless at that point. If you don't have a single-player campaign to go back to, and the multiplayer is dead, you have a $60 hunk of coal that's in your Steam account that you can't really use. In many ways, multiplayer-only games have a sincere and serious shelf life, and there are some which have planned obsolescence. I mean, EA is notorious for shutting down servers for games that it feels have passed their best, and they would much prefer that you buy the sequel. Oh, and people are starting to get a little bit tired of that, so you can understand their hesitance. You can understand why people would turn around and say, I think you should include a single player. I'm unhappy that you didn't. But ultimately, I think that's maybe the least of people's concerns when it comes to Battlefront. Now, I will agree with Peter Moore on this one. I don't want to see another DICE FPS single-player campaign. They all suck. Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4, Medal of Honor, basically every FPS they've made in the past 5 years has a terrible single-player campaign. It's not like they're completely incapable of making a decent single-player FPS campaign. Battlefield Bad Company had decent single-player. Bad Company 2 had okay-ish single-player, significantly better than what they've put out in the last 5 years. And of course, they made Mirror's Edge in 2008, which was a really solid single-player game. But ultimately, the last few years have not been so great from DICE when it comes to campaigns for multiplayer specific and focused shooters, and frankly, we could just do without another one. You know, why waste the time? We know it's not going to be very good, so why bother? Oh, and I suppose you can look at Hardline as well, but that's partially Visceral's fault. Anyway, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the content patch, but before you go, I'd like to give you the OC Remix track of the day. We haven't had a chance to listen to some great remixes in quite some time, so let's do just that. Chrono Trigger, coming up on its 20th anniversary, is one of the most popular games on ocremix.org, with more than 100 tracks available for download. Of course, the game celebrates its 20th anniversary this year, having been released in 1995. This remix includes saxophone. This is a remix of Corridor of Time and Scala's theme, and it is remixed by XPRTNovice and urdailywater. It is by the name of Lost in Time, and it's available for download in the description below this video. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.